My name is Maya Thompson, and I was 32 years old when everything I thought I knew about family and safety collapsed underneath me. I remember the cold of the linoleum in my childhood kitchen under my bare feet, the night my father closed the front door on me, and my mother did not come after him. I remember the way the light from the porch leaked through the stained glass and cut a thin slice of gold across my hands, as if the house itself had decided to judge me by the shape of my palms. I remember saying, "I am sorry," over and over until the words felt empty. Like coins that no one would take. I remember being 28 the summer I left home for good, and how the map on my phone felt like a small, bright window into a life that would not care about how my name sounded when my mother spoke it with disappointment. When I tell this story, I say my age at the moment because age carried weight than the way it always has. 32 is an odd place between young and settled. It is when you can still change direction, and when people start asking about permanence and children and stability. And I had none of those things to offer them. And for that, my parents decided I had none to offer them either. I grew up in a split-level house outside of Cleveland, Ohio, on Maple Ridge Drive, where the maples dropped syrup-colored leaves in the fall, and my mother kept geraniums in the window. My father worked in the assembly plant until the plant closed, and then he took a job driving a truck at night and slept through the afternoons. My parents came from different kinds of small towns. My mother from a suburb where church windows were stained with fundraising posters, and my father from a steel town downriver. I was their middle child. The compromise between my older brother, who had always looked like our father, and my younger sister, who had our mother's exact laugh. I learned early that the house had rules that were not always written. Show gratitude when you are given bread. Never laugh too loud at the table. Do not talk too long on the phone with friends. Do not bring home people who look like trouble. My parents taught me to be careful, and I think they taught me to be small, as a way of protecting me from the world. I wanted to be an architect when I was a child. I made houses out of cardboard and glued them together with a stubborn reverence. But by the time I was 21, I had swapped paper models for spreadsheets and design classes for an internship at a boutique firm in Chicago. The city became the place where I breathed differently, where no neighbor knew the color of my pajamas, and where my name could be spoken without the old family rules sticking to it. In Chicago, I learned that my voice could carry, and that people might listen if it sounded sure enough. At 25, I met a man at a gallery opening whose name was Aaron Price, and he smelled like coffee and rain, and he taught me what it meant to be wanted without apology. We lived in a narrow apartment with a window that looked over a service alley, and we battled over who got the larger pantry shelf like it mattered. We loved the way our hands found each other on the couch, and the way he learned to whistle the tune my grandmother used to hum when she baked. My parents never came to visit because there was no room in their calendars for the city, and because my mother could not understand how a girl from Maple Ridge would live without a yard. The distance between us became a quiet negotiation, until the day my life took a turn that backward-facing mirrors could not predict I lost Aaron to a short disease that stole breath and plans and all of the future tents in our apartment. His bedside was a small, bright space where I learned how to count the slow in and out of a body that was slipping away. I was 29 when he died, and I did not know how to leave the house he had chosen for us, so I stayed. I did not know how to tell my parents that the man who had once carried my toolbox was gone. And when I finally told them on the phone, they hesitated, as if grief on my end was a report card they had to grade. They said the right things at first. They offered condolences that sounded like they had been copied from a card. Then my father said, "You need to get back on your feet. We can help with some money for the funeral." And my mother asked if I had been careful, and when I said yes in the thin voice of someone who had already accepted the shape of tragedy, they said they would send a check, and then they did not. The check had my brother's name on it, for reasons they blurred, and later explained as a practical decision. It was the first time I felt the difference between being their daughter and being someone who had to claim her own survival. After Aaron, I moved twice because every corner of that apartment kept calling his name. I took freelance work and designed small residential projects and taught workshops at a community center. I learned to fill silence with sketches and with the small, precise rituals that kept me upright. I wired money home sometimes when I could, and I told myself that time would make the old hurts less sharp. My mother remarried shortly after my father's retirement. She married a man named Paul, who was polite on Sundays and who liked to collect watches. They moved into a small condo closer to the lake, and at first I thought maybe distance could be a kind of forgiveness. I flew home for holidays and sat at a table where my parents' words came with an extra edge, but I wanted family. So I smiled, I hugged, I set aside the stinging smallness that had become a habitual ache. The morning they disowned me. It was not cinematic. It was a series of banal and viciously ordinary things strung together like Christmas lights. I had come home because my sister had a fever and nobody else could get off work. My mother answered the door with that tight look she wore when she thought someone was trying to sell her something. And then she saw me, and the look fell like a curtain. I held the warmth of my sister to my chest and felt the way her fevered body shivered against my ribs. My mother looked at me like I had dirt on my shoes, and she said, "You are not welcome here," like a verdict. My father stood behind her, and his hand on the banister was white with tension. I remember thinking of the million tiny ways I had tried to be good in their eyes, paying for things, fixing a sink, sending messages that said, "I miss them," like a hymn, and none of it mattered. My sister wanted to sleep, so I tucked her under the quilt my mother had made, and when I kissed her forehead, my mother grabbed my wrist like a judge and said, "You have to leave. I do not want you near her." I said, "She is my sister." And my mother said, "You are the reason she is sick." And then she spit the words out as if they were medicine. She had to swallow to prove a point. I asked for an explanation, and my father told a story that would become the basis for the final act of ostracism. According to them, I had taken money from the family account years earlier when I was 23 and using it to pay for my apartment and my life in Chicago. I was stunned because I had never touched their account. I had taken small loans from my brother once and paid them back with interest, and I could show the proof. If they would just look, my father refused to look because he had already decided the narrative and facts had to bend to the story he wanted to believe. The next words that came out of my mother's mouth were small and cruel. "We cannot trust you anymore. You have to go." Then she walked away and locked me out of the only home I had known since I was a child, without giving me time to gather my things. The key turned from the inside and became the final punctuation on years of growing apart. I stood on the porch with the night air a thin blade across my cheeks, and I understood at that moment how easily belonging could be removed like a coat. I left with my sister's fever and a shoebox of old family photos, and I slept in a cheap motel, and I cried until the paper towels in the bathroom were damp. And I told myself to be better, to be nothing at all, if that was what would make them whole again. I found out later that my mother had been paying someone to look into our financial accounts, and that someone had conjured a ledger of siphoned funds and petty charges and had fabricated transfers into my name. It was a web of small lies built by a man with a talent for numbers and for persuasion. My mother believed because she wanted the story to be simple, because simple stories require less remorse. My father believed because admitting the truth meant admitting he had been vulnerable, and he did not like vulnerability. The truth was that the man my mother had hired had fallen in love with the idea of making people pay for their past mistakes, and he framed me with a methodical cruelty designed to be unassailable. I tried to call my parents and demand they look at the bank statements. My mother hung up the phone, and then she changed the locks on the house and told the neighbors I had left voluntarily. I was erased by a family who had once been my center. There was a hole where my identity had been, and I learned to carry it like a scar. I built a new life in pieces. I moved to Indianapolis and rented a small row house where the ceiling had a faint stain from a previous leak and where the radiators clanged at night like a ship. I rebuilt myself with projects, and with the steady, dull work of showing up, I taught design at the community college, and I started a side business doing renovation consulting for people who wanted to keep their homes but could not afford an architect. My life grew in a patient way, like a garden in a backyard that had been ignored and then watered carefully. I wrote to my sister sometimes, but her replies were more distant each time, and then stopped altogether. Grief had not loosened my mother's resolve. It had hardened it into a belief that she had been right to cut me out. There is a peculiar kind of humiliation in being disowned that is different from grief and different from anger. It sits heavy like an overcoat and makes you clumsy, and it teaches you new habits, like avoiding the familiar routes through the city because they remind you of an older version of yourself. I spent 2 years learning to live with that coat and to take it off in private. My sister's life changed. She married a man named Dan and had a child, and pictures of them came like small missiles in my social feed. I learned to look at them like evidence of a life moving on without me. Every smile at the birthday parties was a proof that I had been edited out of the family album. The man who had framed me prospered for a while because my mother had paid him generously for results, and because he had clients who wanted simple narratives, he sold certainty. He sold a story in which people who were not like them had taken advantage, and for that he was paid. But he had made enemies, and in the arc of his life, his competence became thin, and his past was filled with the kind of mistakes that accumulate around a man who believes he is untouchable. I watched him through the small window of public records and private research, the way one watches a slow train approach. I am not proud of the way I began to plan the undoing of the story they had written about me, but I am honest enough to say there was a small, bright part of me that wanted the world to look at the record and see the truth. In the first year, I did what any rational person would do. I gathered proof. I obtained bank statements and receipts and copies of emails that proved what I had always said, but documentation alone was not enough. There is a human element to belief, and people will cling to stories that comfort them even when evidence undermines them. I needed something more than a ledger. I needed to create consequences that would wedge open the door my mother had closed. I found out that my father had begun to use an old stoop as a place to keep a small pile of his tools, and that he liked to sit in the evenings at the diner on Route 52, where the lighting was always made to flatter the meats on the menu, and where the coffee came heavy black and hot. He picked at the toast and read the sports page like a man marking time. My mother had developed an edge of fear about the neighbors. She had started to talk about safety and security and began to install cameras on the porch and to advocate for gated communities at her new condo association meetings. The man who had been paid to build the story about me had a weakness for public notoriety, and he had ambitions to expand his business into elder planning and estate consultation for wealthy retirees. He had built a brand on tidy narratives and tidy answers. I took a job as a project manager at a small firm that specialized in converting old mansions into assisted living facilities, and, in the next year, I moved into a position where my opinions mattered about property management and client selection. I positioned myself where my work would touch people who were connected to the man who had framed me, because his new clients moved in the same circles as the firm. This is not a romantic line of plotting. It is the slow accrual of opportunities and of being in the right place to make the truth visible. I began to collect testimony not just about the financial fabrication, but about his patterns of deceit, his small betrayals, his habit of preying on old fears. I walked beaches and porches and nursing home lobbies. I listened to stories of relatives who had been misled. I wrote careful reports, and I learned to speak in a voice that was not pleading but factual. I made sure my evidence could not be dismissed as the grudge of a disowned daughter. I hired an investigator, and the investigator found a paper trail of fake invoices and ghost accounts that led back to the man who had built my suffering. He had used forged signatures and fabricated references and had paid a clerk at the bank to mislabel transactions. When I had the documents, I did something people find strange. I invited my parents to dinner under the pretense that I was in town and wanted to reconnect. I rented an inexpensive private room at a restaurant just off the lake, and I cooked a small meal that was clumsy but honest, and I sat across from my mother with the proofs in an envelope hidden under my purse. My mother arrived with the watch collector at her side, and my father came with the slow, defensive posture of a man who expected confrontation. For a second, I felt the old wanting to be chosen again, and I almost apologized for the years I was gone. Then I placed the envelope on the table and pushed it toward my mother, and I said, "Look at this." And she flinched like a small animal, and then she said, "Is this another one of your schemes?" Which is when I realized that the old narrative had burrowed itself deep into her bones. I took out the bank statements and the invoices and the emails, and I read them aloud because reading makes things true in a way that a folded paper cannot. The restaurant hummed around us, and the smell of lemon and butter filled the air. But the room for our private story closed in like a glass box. My mother's face changed through a spectrum I had only ever seen once when she discovered at a funeral that someone false had taken a place in our family. She turned the papers away, as if the smell of ink was contagious. My father squinted at the numbers, and then he said, "This is impossible." And I said, "It is not impossible. It is proof." And he said, "You could have doctored this," and I laughed, because the irony of being accused of forgery by a man who had been persuaded by a paid falsehood was all at once unbearably sharp. The watch collector looked at me with the polite curiosity of someone who buys stories to feel safe, and then he stood up and walked out of the restaurant like a man removing his hand from a hot stove. The man who had framed me did not know I was bringing this to them until the next day, when his assistant called to ask why he had been accused in a quiet public way. He sent messages and threats and tried to hire legal counsel to silence the papers. But the seeds of doubt had taken root. People began to ask questions, and lawyers are usually slow to move until enough doubt becomes a problem for them. My parents could have chosen to examine the documents. They could have taken the uncomfortable detour toward shame and apology. But they chose instead to protect the story that made them safe and to protect the man who had given them a narrative they could live with. My mother told neighbors the papers were forgeries. And my father called me once, and his voice was small and repeated the same sentence. "We do not want you around our family." The man who had been the architect of the lie began to unravel as clients started to ask for copies of receipts, and as colleagues discovered irregularities. He panicked, and then he made mistakes, and the mistakes multiplied, the way a small crack in glass becomes a spider web. I watched as his business was examined, and as loans were called in, and as the bank clerk who had been bought with gifts and promises turned up evidence of those meetings. In the meantime, my father fell ill, the sort of illness that arrives with the quiet of a closing door. He had pneumonia that masked itself as a tiredness, and then he could not climb the stairs without stopping to rest. He coughed in the night, and the sound cut through the small house on Maple Ridge like an alarm. My mother called me not as the daughter she had once been, but as a person who could make arrangements. And when she did, she said, "We need your help." And the words were sharp and small like an accusation. I sat on the other end of the line, and I felt an old animal part of me that wanted to rush to the bedside and smooth the pillow, and to be allowed to stand in the circle of care. But I had learned to set boundaries and to see how comfort could be used as a lever. I asked, "What happened?" And she said, "He is getting worse." And then she said, "The bills are piling up and we did not know where to go." and the voice broke, and I heard the watch of time, as if someone had opened a pocket and let the hands roll out. I could have said no, and I could have watched them flounder and fall the way they had done to me. Instead, I arranged for a private nurse, and I spoke to lawyers and to doctors, and I visited my parents once, not as a supplicant, but as a professional with a plan. I organized the kitchen. I found the medical records. I learned how to manage oxygen tanks and to help my father sit up without making the pain worse. My mother watched me move with a slow, hostile admiration. I suppose she had expected me to decline, but there was an old muscle memory between us that made kindness possible despite everything. While I was there, I also made sure that the files and the evidence were delivered to the right people, that the accountant who had enabled the fraud was audited, and that banks were notified of the forgeries. The man who had framed me began to lose clients and then friends, and then his house was listed for sale. The evening my father was moved into the hospital, my mother sat in the car and clutched my hand and said, "We were wrong." And I felt the earth tilt, but not in the way I had imagined. She did not say it to confess, she said it as a way to be relieved of something she did not want to carry any longer. She wanted absolution without consequence. I told her that I had already started proceedings and that the law would take a while, and she said, "I just want him to be okay." And in that sentence, I heard all the unexamined choices that had led us here. Being the one who could help them did not make me forgiven. It made me necessary. And in a strange way, it made me the instrument of their accountability. Hospital rooms smell like lemon disinfectant and old magazines, and the machines make soft, indifferent noises that speak of measurement more than of mercy. My father lay thin and pale, and when he opened his eyes, he did not look surprised to see me. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a final bill. I sat holding his hand, and I felt the smallness of all our lives. My mother came and sat on the other side, and we three existed in the small rectangle of the room, the air conditioner with its quiet breath. In the weeks that followed, the man who had built the story about me was prosecuted for fraud and for forgery, and for exploiting the elderly, and the newspapers printed his name and pictures, and people who had once nodded politely at cocktail parties now avoided eye contact, as if shame were contagious. My parents lost some money in the process because their payments to him were called into question, and because they had to reimburse some of the fees they had paid, they argued in the kitchen over payments and insurance, and the things people argue about when their life is measured in lines of coverage. I watched as my mother learned to be small in a different way. She learned to apologize, but the apologies were clumsy and often came with a postscript about how difficult it had been for her and how she had been scared. My father recovered in a way that left him unsteady but alive, and he began to ask me questions about the house as if he were counting what he had left. There is a kind of accounting that happens when a family fractures and then tries to reassemble. You calculate debts and favors and what can be exchanged to make things fit. In the end, I made a choice that people rarely understand. I forgave them in the private language I used to fill my own days. I forgave them because I refused to let the hate inside me become the shape of who I was. But forgiveness does not mean forgetting, and it does not mean returning to the place where injury can be repeated. I helped arrange care for my father, but I insisted on legal boundaries and on financial transparency. I made sure my name was removed from any false documents, and I demanded that the house be renovated to make sure my mother could not be preyed upon again. I arranged for counseling for my sister, who had been used as an instrument in the story, and I made certain that the man who had harmed us faced the consequences of his actions. In the months that followed, people said strange things to me. They said, "How did you do it?" Or, "They must have been so sorry." And some people said, "You are so noble." And one or two people suggested I had been playing a longer game, and they looked at me with something close to admiration that I did not want. In my quiet moments, I would stand by the window of my house in Indianapolis and look at the street lamp and feel the old coat of exile brush against my skin. The truth is that I never wanted to be the person who returned to save those who had cut me out. I did it because the line between vengeance and responsibility had blurred, and because I had realized that the only way to be whole was to fix what had been broken, even if the repair was not for me alone. The final accounting was not a movie scene. It was the slow legal process and the improbable recovery of trust, and the small, steady rituals that family builds like a fragile dam against the flood of chance. The harsh payoff came on a winter morning, 2 years after the locks had been changed, when my mother called me and said, "I am sorry." And when I arrived at the house, the front porch held frost, and the old maple shed, its last leaves. My father was outside shoveling the walk, the way men do when they are trying to prove their usefulness to themselves. And I felt something like pity and then something like triumph. I did not shout or dance. I did not press my face to the glass and crow. The man who had framed me had been convicted, and he sat in a cell that had none of the comforts of his ambition. My mother had to sell some pieces of jewelry to pay legal fees, and the watch collector had stopped calling. The community had seen him stripped of his reputation, and that sight has a gravity of its own. My final act was not dramatic. I walked up the porch, and I passed my father the shovel, and I said, "Do not overdo it." And he laughed and said, "You always did have a way with getting things done." And I said, "I am Maya, and I am 32, and watching his face, when he finally looked at me and did not flinch, was the last small victory. The harshest part of the payoff was that they had to see me not as a villain, but as their daughter, and to accept that their own choices had consequences that would leave marks on all of us. I had not wanted to break them. I had wanted them to see and to change. But change is a slow animal, and sometimes it requires the threat of loss before it moves. I am not a different person for what I did. I am still the woman who likes strong coffee and who sketches small houses on napkins. I still have nights when the old hurt arrives like a visitor, and I let it take a chair and sit with me for a while. But I also have a life that is built of small, steady things, and the knowledge that I can set a boundary and keep it. If someone asks me now how I survived being disowned, I tell them the practical things first. Gather proof. Stand firm. Hire people who know the law. And then I tell them. The other thing, which is this, do not let other people define your worth, because their need to be comfortable will make monsters out of the truth. In the end, the payoff was not the man's prison. It was the way my parents had to meet me again on my own terms, and the way the world had to look at the truth of what had been done and name it for what it was. When the dust settled, I chose to stay or not to stay, depending on the day and on the small courtesies we could manage. The house on Maple Ridge still smells faintly of my mother's geraniums when I visit. And one afternoon, my sister brought her child to my apartment and pressed a drawing into my hand and said, "Aunt Maya," and the word is heavy with the possible futures of us. I kept the drawing on my fridge like a small treaty. Sometimes, the most cinematic justice is not the thunderclap. It is the slow knucklebone grind of accountability and the final season of consequences that leaves the guilty naked and the guilty who plead ignorance, learning to carry the weight of what they have done. I had been disowned once, and I became their only way through the terrible business of getting old and paying for mistakes, and in doing so, I made sure that the truth had teeth, and that those teeth could bite hard enough to make the lie stop. The ending was harsh, and it was poetic in the way a wound can be when it finally stops bleeding and heals into a scar that is not pretty. But it is honest, and it tells the story of survival, and of being the sort of person who will stand when the house of cards is blown, and will count the cost and demand that the price be paid.